Subtitling by Zweites Deutsches Fernsehen. February 15, 2026. We are in the fourth year, day 357 since the start of the full-scale invasion. Welcome. I greet you. For the situation report, in today's report, we'll take a look at the situation in Ukraine and in Russia after about 1.5 months. We also see a kind of Ukrainian offensive, or at least the beginnings of a larger offensive. And what we'll also look at is how the Russians are trying to keep their soldiers in check, as well as much more. Where do we stand now? This winter is extremely tough for Ukraine. The Russian attacks on the energy system have severely affected many cities, not just Kiev. Power outages, damaged grids, destroyed substations, all of this is part of everyday life. Even when the cold subsides soon, the infrastructure in many places will remain severely damaged. Big things that can be destroyed within seconds usually take weeks, sometimes months, to rebuild, only to be hit again by Russian missiles. Repairs are underway, but a complete restoration will sometimes take years, and with summer, new risks arise. People often assume that once winter ends, it's no longer a problem since heating homes isn't needed. That may be true, but heat puts additional strain on the grid, while many systems are still operating on a temporary basis. Still, the country is doing its best to endure, and that's not just talk. Everyday life goes on, businesses are operating, people are going to work, schools are open, children are going to school. Cities often only function under improvised conditions. But everyday life goes on as best as it can. It's almost as if this war is just a side issue. The strain is high, but society is not falling apart, at least not yet. But at the front, the situation continues just as before. The line is holding so far. For Russian troops, however, the situation is a bit more complicated. The loss of Starlink and restrictions on messenger services are making their communication more difficult. At the same time, attacks on Russian refineries continue. Russian air defenses are being systematically targeted, as are their radar systems. Ukrainian drones are hitting military targets deep inside Russian territory, and Ukrainian sea drones are waiting for the end of winter. As soon as the ice near the coast disappears, this section of the front will certainly become more active again. Within Ukraine, there are also personnel changes in military leadership and politics. According to the Ukrainians, this fresh start has streamlined internal processes and shortened decision-making paths. That especially strengthens operational capability at the core level. But that doesn't mean the Ukrainian army is perfect. Quite the opposite. We recently looked at how Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, often makes decisions down to the platoon leader level through his old tactics and direct orders, which are absolutely fatal for the Ukrainian army. For example, he also favors certain brigades that he likes, while others often get nothing and barely survive with what they receive. So, as I said, there are many problems within both the Russian and the Ukrainian army, and that's not something you can just argue away. Nevertheless, we can see approaches and even implementations here to get these problems under control. Internationally, support continues to exist, even if it is emphasized differently politically and publicly. In Munich, clear signals of solidarity were sent, but these are of no real help to soldiers at the front or civilians in cold apartments. At least Europe is now even expanding its own arms industry in cooperation with Ukraine in some areas. That's already good for us, because if we ever have to go through a case of defense, at least we can prepare ourselves for drones. So these aren't just short-term headlines, but rather structural developments. This gives Ukraine a certain reserve of resilience, militarily, economically, and socially, even if it is very limited. On the Russian side, signs of economic tension are growing. The oil sector faces pressure, despite Moscow's efforts to redirect exports. The issue of the so-called shadow fleet in the Baltic Sea remains unresolved and continues to be a geopolitical risk. Are Russian losses at the front continuing to rise? Meanwhile, Russia is escalating attacks on cities, energy sites, and civilian infrastructure. What is particularly noticeable is the increase in attacks on transportation hubs, including railway lines and even passenger trains. This aims to stop Moscow from gaining a decisive battlefield advantage, which we are witnessing. So pressure on civil society keeps rising. Politically, Russia is trying to buy time, delay negotiations, or not allow them at all, and increase the pressure. The strategic goal remains unchanged and maximalist, It's not about limited territorial gains, but rather about complete control or the actual destruction of all of Ukraine. Globally, however, the focus is shifting. The United States, for example, is concentrating more on domestic issues and national interests. Europe faces a strategic decision to be an independent security policy actor and economic area, but without instruments of power. For Ukraine, integration into a European defense system is more than just a political option. It is rather part of the answer to the question of what this war is being fought for in the first place. For Europe, it would also be a clear signal that this threat from Russia is being understood structurally and that there is a willingness to confront it with strength. In the coming weeks, the next European Union sanctions package will also be an important indicator. Russia responds primarily to pressure, not to appeals. Substantial coordinated measures do have an effect, but they need to be clearly stated. By the end of spring, it should become clear whether a ceasefire is realistic, or whether we will now see another phase of escalation that will accompany us through the year 2026. And that's what I expect as well. So the status for spring 2026 for me, dated February 15th, remains unchanged. Ukraine is still at war with Russia after 1,554 days fighting against what was once the world's second strongest military. A look at the map and the estimated situation in the Umpom-Kroska area shows the movement on the Ukrainian side, which we will now take a closer look at. Here we have two areas marked in blue. Likewise, here on this side, which in the last few weeks, if not months, since I think New Year's, have been recaptured by the Ukrainians. That's not much if we take a look at it. The Russians have also advanced significantly over the past year. And in fact, over the past year, the Russians have been able to capture this area here, basically this part up to the border, more or less with Yelika and Novosilka, as well as everything else that has been marked here. Compared to other attacks, this has been a very, very significant territorial gain for the Russian side, something we actually see very, very rarely. The Ukrainians have mostly withdrawn, for example, from these villages marked with green pins. I reported once that these were abandoned together here. The Ukrainians withdrew and moved into this area and were then almost encircled here. Next was the battle for Hujapol, this one here. And then the Russians took the last villages or districts in this area and have now started moving further west to gain a foothold here as well. The Ukrainians are more or less on the defensive here rather than on the offensive, but things look different a little further north. We can already see some attacks here. There was one here. Well, I would say amateurs would claim it was a breakthrough, but of course it wasn't. Just as there wasn't one back then at Vonkrovsk in the north towards Devropilya, there wasn't one here either. A few isolated Russian soldiers somehow managed to get through the Ukrainian lines, mostly through gaps, and then entrench themselves in these two locations. Ukrainians have recently recaptured these areas, as shown. We covered that in the situation report, but now the focus is on this area. Here we can see how they were able to advance further. Right now, all the villages within the yellow area are being fiercely contested. The Ukrainians are trying to get through here in the west of Verbov with another attack and bypass the village. I assume that the Russians simply control it too well. If we take a close look at the place, here are the houses, or rather, the neighborhoods inside, and the Russians have the very, very big advantage here that they can hardly be attacked from the north at all. There are three larger groups here. There is only one road that runs along here, and of course it can be controlled very, very well by the Russian side, because if the Ukrainians come from the north, they have to get through a very, very narrow corridor here, which is about 188 meters wide on the map. You can protect that with really just a few soldiers, just like the corridor a bit further to the west, which is a maximum of 245 meters wide. That means if the Ukrainians try to get through here, they would first encounter the first Russian line inside here, which is usually very well covered since it's located somewhere between the rows of houses. So what we have are two corridors that can be defended very, very well with just a few soldiers. And then you would also have the west here, which is logically defended a bit better by the Russians, because all the soldiers they can basically save on these two small corridors can be moved here to the west and defend the place from the flank. For this reason, the Ukrainians are currently attacking between the two villages in order to possibly gain a foothold somewhere further south or to attack towards the west, possibly in this direction here, in order to create more pressure together with the other two secondary attacks and push the Russians back from this area. But what we're seeing are just the beginnings. It's nothing major yet. Only a few battalions are involved in these attacks, as far as I can tell. And in addition, there's a larger attack in the direction of Borisove. The Ukrainians have attacked here. What we're seeing here in the video that's being shown are basically the Russian countermeasures to stop this attack. The whole thing took place roughly here at the tip of the attack area, and partly in the town of Borisove itself. That means the Ukrainians are, as I said, trying to attack the outlying villages here. And at the same time, they're also trying to bypass some of these areas to increase the pressure further in the rear. From several sections of the front, more reports and footage are emerging that are supposed to show a particularly brutal internal disciplinary measure of the Russian army, something we've looked at many times before. Reports say soldiers are often stripped naked, tied to trees, and left in freezing temperatures. Such punishments are reportedly used as deterrents in cases of insubordination, drunkenness, fighting, or desertion attempts. In cold conditions, this brings not just humiliation, but a serious life threat. Below 0 degrees hypothermia can set in quickly. Frostbite, circulatory collapse, or permanent damage are real risks. This approach fits the pattern that has been repeatedly seen since the beginning of the war. Instead of professional military discipline and regulated procedures, some units resort to anarchic, violent, punitive measures. That points to massive leadership problems and a culture of fear. A good military, after all, is led and operates primarily through respect, not sheer fear. It's just like raising children. You can imagine it the same way in the military. A child is much more willing to do something, even against their will, if they have respect for their parents, not if they're afraid of them. In winter, stress, frustration, and conflicts within the troops intensify. When morale and supplies decrease, internal violence often increases. Such methods are meant to ensure control, but they can also have the opposite effect. So they destroy trust, deeply undermine camaraderie, and deepen internal decay, regardless of which side you're on. Such practices are not a sign of military strength. They are simply an indicator of absolute discipline problems and being overwhelmed, and a system that can't enforce control through leadership anymore and must rely on intimidation. So while Russian units are struggling with communication problems, facing the Stalin issue after the removal of Stalin, the Ukrainian side seems to be wasting no time. Russian bloggers are reporting on further attacks just like the ones we've just seen, only now in front of the entire public. But please don't take this as some kind of cheer or anything like that. You shouldn't imagine it that way. It's not like a large-scale counteroffensive with lots and lots of units with some army divisions trying to break through everywhere, just to take back all the Russian territorial gains of the past few months. No, these have really just been local attacks so far because the Ukrainians have actually announced offensives for 2026. But what we're seeing now are more short-term measures to secure these territorial gains due to the loss of Starlink. As long as the Russians don't have an alternative to it or don't reorganize themselves. In Sochi, on the Black Sea coast, residents and authorities reported multiple air raid alarms and explosions today. According to initial reports, the incident was directed at targets in the surrounding area toward the occupied Crimea and in the Krasnodar region. Witnesses reported several detonations immediately after warning sirens were triggered. Meanwhile, reports say about 200,000 Ukrainian drones have been launched at Crimea and Russia's southern coast. The number is exceptionally high and would indicate a coordinated, large-scale operation rather than a single, isolated attack. If the information is correct, Ukraine has once again shown that it is capable of penetrating deep into Russian territory and putting targets far beyond the front line under pressure. For Sochi, this is notable since the city has rarely been directly impacted by combat and was seen as a relatively safe rear area. By launching simultaneous and large-scale attacks, Ukraine aims to tie up Russian air defenses control resources, and of course create psychological pressure as well. If missiles and drones can fly in series over the Black Sea, and especially over southern Russia, doesn't that force Moscow to deploy forces to keep things under control? Especially when air defense systems are pulled from the front and then used here in deep defense. Has that already been a good plan for Ukraine? Thank you to all subscribers, channel members, and the Argo crew, especially Lieutenant Colonel Renica, Sila, Dietrich, Ferdy, and Meyerhofer. Please subscribe, comment, and see you in the next report.